Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. My name is Juan Londoño for those of you that don't know me, and today we are not doing a Photo Philosophy Friday video. Today's video is a little more kind of how-to or what should I. The name of today's video is prime lenses versus zoom lenses. Which ones should I use? Now I already have two videos on lenses, and I'm going to leave those links down below in the description, and I'm also going to attach the icons at the end so you can click on them if you want to see those. But for those of us that understand lenses a little more, this is just going to be a recap, right? So what are the biggest differences between prime versus zoom? Now, even though this is not a prime lens because it's actually a converter, this is the size of the prime lens that's on the camera right now. And I'm using a Canon M6 Mark II to record this video, right? This is the size of the 22mm f2 that's on that camera, right? This, however, is the size of a zoom lens. So there's an obvious difference in size. Now, not every prime lens is this small, right? Some, because they have a bigger aperture, they're called faster lenses, are a little bigger, but they're not this big, right? This weighs like twice what the camera weighs. This is full of glass, and it's a wonderful lens, but it's got its pros and cons like everything else. After we're done discussing the pros and the cons, when we talk about these lenses really quick, the purpose of this video really is to let some of the folks that are kind of newer into photography know which type of lenses are good for which type of photography. So if you're doing portraits, for example, what do you use? Do you use a zoom lens or a prime lens, right? If you're doing sports, do you use a zoom lens or a prime lens, right? So that's going to be the question, and I've been asked that many times. People are buying their first camera, sometimes to take one of my classes, and they'll ask, Juan, you know, I know that the camera comes with a kit, but I'm thinking of just getting the camera alone and getting a better lens. What do you recommend, a prime lens or a zoom lens? So the fact that they even know enough to ask that question is wonderful, because that at least, you know, there's something to start with there, right? I can approach them and say, well, you know, talk to me about what the differences are between prime and zoom. What do you know to be the differences? And what do you perceive to be the pros and cons? And I let them speak for a little while, and then I correct whatever, you know, misnomers they have, right? And then we take it from there. So let's get into this quickly. Prime lenses. What are the biggest advantages? And like I said, this is and I don't know, I think it's going to focus it, right? Maybe if I block my face. This is a converter, but this is the size. This is exactly the size of the lens. Actually, the lens might be a little smaller than this. So what are the obvious advantages of a prime lens? Well, for one, comparing it to that zoom lens that I just showed you, this is a lot smaller, right? Smaller is good when you want to travel light and you don't have a lot of room. Some people like to go, for example, into street photography with maybe one extra lens in their pocket, and they wear like cargo pants or something like that. And this is a wonderful way to take care of that. So you're not carrying a backpack, you're not making a lot of noise on the street. Hey, I'm a photographer with expensive gear. Maybe you want to mug me or whatever, right? There are some parts of town that you don't want to do that with. So this is a great way to carry a small lens in a pocket. It's small. Because this is smaller, it's also lighter than this, right? That's an obvious benefit. And again, lighter means that I can take this thing anywhere with me. Even if I am carrying multiple prime lenses, it's a lot easier to carry 3 or 4 of these little guys than it is to carry, you know, a couple of those really big heavy lenses. Let's talk about one of the side effects of being smaller and lighter. Because a lens, if this were a lens, because a lens like this is a lot smaller, there are less glass elements in here. So my 22mm f2 that's on that camera right now may have, and I should have done the research before, but it may have 5 glass elements inside, right? This thing, and I put it on the floor for a second, this thing has something like 13 glass elements. There are lenses with even more than that. So the obvious problem there is that each glass element introduces a little bit of distortion. Whether it be because of the shape of the glass or the impurities in the glass, it's going to introduce a little distortion. When you put 5 of them together, well, you got 5 times that distortion. And if you have 13 of them, you have 13 elements in there causing a little distortion. So that's why when you hear, and we'll go into the other point, a prime lens tends to be sharper for that exact reason. Because there are less glass elements in here, there's less possibility for, you know, distortion. These small lenses, or prime lenses, tend to be sharper. Now, like I said, not every prime lens is tiny, right? A lens that might be this small is nice. Many prime lenses are actually this big, right? Because this is an L series, it's professional glass, so this is a 1.4, it's very wide, right? Let me see if this will actually focus on here. Right. It's a beautiful lens. It was a gift from my brother, actually. So a lens like this is a lot bigger as a prime lens, but it's still a lot smaller than this thing, right? If you have to focus on these, right? This is a lot smaller and a lot lighter as a prime lens. There are 2 things left that I want to talk about. And for lenses, it's price. Typically, when we're talking about the same grade, so here we're talking about L series glass for Canon, which is professional glass, right? When you take this 35mm prime, it's a 1.4, this lens new may be something like $1,500, just as an example, right? That zoom lens I just showed you is $2,200. So zoom lenses, because they have more mechanisms in them, because they have more glass in them, they're a little more intricate to build, there's more weight, there's more material, they tend to be a little more expensive. After all, you're talking about a lens, a zoom lens, that's giving you the ability to zoom in and out. So you can go from a wide focal length to a more narrow focal length. And this is all technology that they have to consider when they're building these things. Whereas a prime lens is giving you one focal length, right? Whether it's 35mm or 24mm or 50mm or 100mm. If you want to get closer, you have to walk up to the subject. If you want to get further, you have to walk back. So price is definitely important here, right? Now, the last category I want to talk about is prime lenses tend to be faster. Now, personally, I'll be honest with you. I don't like that word because a lens can't be faster. What do you mean by faster? I could see a new person, you know, in photography coming up to me and saying, Juan, how does this become faster? Like, do you roll it down a hill and it gets to the bottom faster? Actually, that's a good explanation. And maybe the zoom lens is going to be faster in that case because it's heavier. But no, that's not the explanation. So what faster means is because a prime lens can be purchased with a bigger aperture, right? Really big mouth. It lets more light in. This is a 1.4, so it lets a lot of light in. When you let a lot of light into your camera, things get brighter, and that gives you the opportunity to dim that light or to darken the picture, right? Because there's too much light coming in. If I take this lens and I put it on my camera and I open it up to 1.4, which is completely wide open out in broad sunlight, it's too much light. So even if I drop my ISO down to 100, too much light. So now I've got to take my speed and go faster and faster and faster and faster so that shutter opens and closes, the shutter opens and closes, I should go this way, opens and closes in the camera a lot faster, therefore blocking more light. So as your shutter speed becomes quicker and quicker so you can block out more light, your camera has become faster, not the lens. The lens doesn't control speed. But people call it a fast lens because it allows you to make your shutter speed faster. Like I said, I don't care for that terminology. If I could change it, I would. It's a brighter lens, a wider lens, a more open lens. There are so many ways that we can talk about this. Faster is probably not the best of terms. So if you were ever confused by that, I hope that this clarifies it. A lens cannot be faster. It's only faster because it allows your camera to be faster. So those are the major pros to having a prime lens, right? A lens with a fixed focal length. 35mm is beautiful for street photography. This is a little big, but If I want to get closer to that building, I'm going to have to cross the street. If I want to get further away from, you know, whatever, I'm going to have to step back. And if I'm on a cliff and I'm trying to get this beautiful tree from this angle, and I look back and, you know, it's not very good for me to keep walking back, then I'm kind of screwed. A zoom lens would have been better in that case. So for those photographers that are kind of new, I hope this paints a clear picture, right? We talked about the advantages of a prime lens. Well, the advantages of the zoom lens are just the opposite, or basically the disadvantages of the prime lens. The disadvantage of the prime lens is that there's very little flexibility. You have very little flexibility. Like I just said, you need to walk up and down if you want to get closer or further from something. That's where this thing shines, right? You can stand or sit wherever you are and you zoom in and out with your hand and you get closer and further away from things. I've been in situations, and if you've taken pictures, you know, more than a few years, you probably have too. I did a wedding. When I was getting started with weddings, I was doing, you know, more affordable weddings and just dropping my price so people would sample me, right? So they can get a feel for how I worked and how I not only took pictures, but how I worked with people. And one of my first jobs was in South Carolina. And I did this wedding in a small place, and it was kind of a restaurant area, kind of a hall, an event hall, but it doubled as a restaurant. And the family wanted to be in this room and they wanted to take a picture together. And I thought, sure, let's pull it off. I had a 24-70 2.8 lens, which is a wonderful zoom lens. I went all the way back to the wall. This family stood against the other wall in this room, and family just kept walking in and walking in and walking in. And before you knew it, I couldn't fit that whole group in my frame. So I started asking the kids to kneel and the gentlemen to kneel, and it, you know, it was good because when you do an affordable wedding like that, people are more flexible, and you know, they know what they're up against, right? They were affordable not only in the photographer but in the hall itself, so they knew that they didn't have a lot of space. In that case, it would have behooved me to have something like it depends on the company, right? Some companies do 15 to 35, others do 16 to 35, but it would have helped me out a lot if I had, you know, that lens, something like a zoom lens that was completely wide angle and let me go even wider than that 24. In the long term, is having prime lenses cheaper, or is having a zoom lens cheaper? Remember what I just asked, long term. So what do I mean by that? Well, for example, the holy trinity of lenses means you buy 3 lenses and they're supposed to do magic for you, right? What are they? They're the 15 to 35, right? So you cover that spectrum, very wide, and both of those numbers are wide angle because anything lower than 50 millimeter is a wide angle. So this is a 15 to 35, so it's wide angle completely. Then you go from 24 to 70, so it overlaps with the 35 a little bit, but you're going from wide angle to telephoto because 70 is above the 50 millimeter standard, right? And then a 70 to 200, and that covers you from 15 millimeters to 200, and you can buy those 3 lenses at a 2.8 aperture, and you have an amazing set of lenses. Now, you don't have to buy Pro Glass. You can buy those in a cheaper, you know, price range where the f-stop is varying, and that's fine. But my point is 3 zoom lenses, which are still going to be more expensive than the prime counterparts, is what many photographers consider the Holy Grail, right? The Trinity. Holy Grail. The Trinity of lenses, the Holy Trinity. So with those 3 lenses, you can go anywhere and you cover your full spectrum, right, of focal length. Whereas if I'm a photographer carrying prime lenses and I want good glass, for example, like this, I'm going to get a 24 millimeter, I'm going to get a 35 probably, a 50, and even if all of these were 1.4, they're still up there in price. And then you're going to get an 85 and then maybe a 100, right? And then a 2-time teleconverter so you can make the 100 a 200, or maybe you'll just buy a 300 millimeter. Now, if you're going to go hiking with that and you want the clearest possible pictures, you're going to be carrying 4 or 5 prime lenses. The weight is now heavier than your zoom lenses and the price is now higher. So that's why I ask, think long term, right? Long term, it may be cheaper for some photographers, depending on the type of photography they're doing, if they just buy those 3 zoom lenses and that's it. That's in their bag with their camera and they go everywhere with these. Before we go on, water break. If you don't have some water with you, this is the ritual on these videos. please pause your video and take a water break. We'll be right back. Okay, I hope you're back and I hope you have your water. So the question now, let's answer this. Who uses what, all right? Prime versus zoom. I'm gonna go break it down by field. These are just suggestions from 30 some odd years of photography. It doesn't mean this is the answer. Anytime somebody tells you this is what you should do or shouldn't do, take that all with a grain of salt. There's no fixed answer for any of this, right? It depends on your taste. It depends on what you're doing. It depends on what camera you have. It depends sometimes on where you live. It depends on so many factors. But as a general guideline, right? Not a rule by any means. As a general guideline, these are the lenses you use for this type of photography. Wedding photography, right? Wedding photography, you need a lot of flexibility. You don't always have the time to run up and down aisles. So you want a zoom lens, assume this is a zoom lens for a second, that you can pop on your camera and you can zoom in and out, get closer and further away from your subjects. So wedding photographers benefit immensely from that holy trinity of lenses, those 3 zoom lenses I talked to you about, right? I would go into a wedding with 2 cameras. One of them is going to have that 24-70 because that's on like 90% of the time. And if I have 2 cameras, the other camera is going to vary between my 15-35. If I'm generally, like for example, in the reception hall and I'm walking around and I need that wide angle, or if I'm in the ceremony and I need to get closer to the pastor or the priest, whatever, right? And to the couple, and I'm at the end of the aisle, then maybe I want that 70-200, and maybe even with a 2-time teleconverter, depending on how big the church or the cathedral or the mosque or wherever I am, right? So those 3 lenses, very important for wedding photographers. Does it mean that you can't shoot a wedding with prime lenses? Absolutely not. Many photographers I know only want to shoot weddings with prime lenses. They have 3 cameras. They'll keep a 35, they'll keep a 50, and they'll keep a 100, and they move around with these cameras, or 2 cameras, and they switch a couple of lenses. But they have no problem doing that. They feel they get sharper images while the camera is on them. It weighs a little less, but they have an extra camera. So, you flip that, right? It depends. Sports photography. What do you use if you're into sports? Well, again, it depends. If you're shooting, your kids playing soccer or baseball or whatever it is, football, you might want the flexibility of a 70-200, maybe even put a 2-time teleconverter on that, and you can get closer, you can get a little further away. If at the end of the day they want to do a group picture, you may keep that lens on 70mm and just step back a bit, and you can still kind of squeeze the group in, right? So it gives you flexibility. If you're a professional sports photographer, like you see in the news, and they have those big white Canon lenses, or the black ones from Nikon and other companies, Sony. I think Sony uses some white ones as well, because that's for the sun, by the way, because they don't get so hot. And then the glass, doesn't end up shifting, and you don't end up getting blur because of the heat, right? So what do they want? Professional photographers that shoot sports, they want a really sharp image. So they'll pay $3,800, $5,000 for a 300mm 2.8 or a 400mm 4.0. That's what they want. They want to get close, and they want prime because it has less glass. It has a really big mouth, hence the faster lens. Remember we talked about that, the word I don't like. Because it lets so much light in, they can make their shutter speed really fast, so they can grab that picture in the middle of the throw and just crispy sharp pictures, right? Everybody that shoots photography for sports loves that. If you shoot portraiture or portraits, headshots, what would you use? Well, I personally would use a prime lens. I have a little more flexibility in terms of walking up to the person and walking a little further away. I'm not going to use a wide angle prime because then I have to be in their face. It distorts their face a little. Some people like it. Some people like to shoot portraits with 35mm, 50mm, and I've even seen some interviews of, excuse me, photographers that will shoot portraits with a 24mm. Because they're trying to grab the surroundings, not just the person. So if you want maybe a full-bodied person or half-bodied and a lot of the surroundings, you can use a 35mm, right? But generally, when we're talking about the classic portraiture photography, you're talking about a headshot. And for that, 85mm for a standard 35mm camera, full frame, an 85mm lens is what you want. Even 100 is good. To be honest with you, I prefer the 100. I prefer being a little further away from people because it makes them feel a little more comfortable when you're not close to them. And as long as I have the space, of course, right? If I'm in a tight studio, I can't do that. I need the 85, maybe even a 50. But the point here is you want crispy shots. You want to blur that background, so you want to open up that lens a little more, and primes allow you to do that better. Street photography. Well, for street photography, for me, it's almost always going to be a prime. And the reason is, prime lenses are a lot smaller. Remember I showed you this? There are little pancake lenses. Fuji's got one. I think theirs is a, what do they have? Well, I know there's a popular 23mm 2.0 for Fuji, but that's not the one I'm thinking of. I think there's another one that's a 28mm 2.0, and it's a flat little lens. If you're out on the street and you have a small camera and you're trying to be discreet, right? You want a small lens. So a zoom lens is typically not going to be your friend for that because they're bulkier, they're bigger, they're heavier. If you're trying to keep your camera down at your waist level and you pop open the, the screen and people are coming towards you and you don't want to do this because they're going to know that you're taking a picture of them, you kind of want to look down at your camera and pretend like you're adjusting it and take a couple of pictures. Prime lenses are going to be better. Does it mean you can't shoot street photography with a zoom lens? Absolutely not. You can put a 15 to 35 on there and it's going to give you versatility, it's going to give you flexibility, it's going to look a lot bigger, a lot more intimidating, but you can still keep it down at your waist level and seem a little discreet as long as you don't put it up to your face. Is any of this legal when we talk about street photography, taking pictures of people? Yes, absolutely. As long as you're in public areas, if you look at the laws for most countries and cities, it's perfectly okay. Now, can a person come up to you and say, I want you to remove my picture, I saw you taking my picture? Yes, people can approach you. Can you argue it? Yes, you can. Personally, me as a photographer, if I snap a picture of somebody, if they're suspicious and they come up to me and say, did you just take a picture of me? I'm going to say, yes, I was capturing the landscape with people and you happen to be in that picture. If they say, I'd like you to remove that picture, please. I don't know why they want that. They may have many reasons. Maybe they're not supposed to be in that city. Whatever the reason is, I don't argue with a person. It's not worth it, right? I can take another picture. I can take many more pictures. So I'll pull my camera up. I'll show them the picture. I'll delete it. And I'll say, I apologize if I offended you. That was not my intention. And most of the time, people are going to say, that's fine. If they're really, buttholes, then they're just going to frown and leave. But, it doesn't happen very often, but just keep in mind it does happen. So again, the more discreet prime lenses, the better. What if you do product photography, like you're taking pictures of small things on tables? I'm going to tell you most of the time you're going to be happier with a prime lens, especially if it's a macro, because it allows you to get closer. Shooting little things like rings and earrings, and then you definitely want a macro. You want to get right in there and you want it as crispy, sharp as possible. And a prime lens is going to be that lens for you. Again, can you use a zoom? Yes. My 24 to 70mm macro, it's a macro lens. So that lens was beautiful for that reason. I can get right in there, put it 70mm, get a little close, but it doesn't beat my 100mm macro. And I know there are 50mm macros as well, right? So whichever one suits you, you can try them out at the store. Take your camera, pop the lenses on and see which one you feel comfortable with. But a macro is going to be the way to go. Again, this is not a rule. It's not a law. It's go with what your gut says. But personally, I think macro is better. We have two more styles left. One of them is landscape. Now, that's going to be a mixed bag. I know photographers that prefer putting two lenses, for example, in their bag with one camera and hitting the hills, right? And if they have to backpack, they're okay with that slight extra weight of the zoom lenses. They feel like they have a lot of flexibility, especially if they're L series lenses. They're heavier and bigger, but the sharpness is pretty good, right? So they're going to go with a 15 to 35 and maybe a 24 to 70. And that covers, for landscapes, a great deal of versatility and flexibility. I want to take a moment to apologize. If you notice, I'm wearing a different shirt. I was looking through the video and there's a piece that's missing. It got cut, and I'm not sure exactly how. Sometimes parts of a memory card become corrupt. Sometimes it's something with the camera. You never know. These glitches happen. So I want to just cut in here and fill in the piece that's missing. So we're talking about landscapes, and we talked about how many photographers prefer having zoom capabilities because it gives them flexibility when they go up into a mountain or hiking. They just have to carry one lens. I personally know a photographer that has a high megapixel camera and likes to go hiking with a 15 to 35 millimeter lens. So that's the only lens that he takes. And if he needs to get in a little closer than that, then he crops. And he can because he has a good lens and he has a good camera with high megapixels. So that's one of the options. Personally, what I wanted to discuss with you, and again, this is all about personal taste. When I do landscapes, I prefer prime lenses. So I prefer going in with a 24 and a 35. Now, technically speaking, I can just do the 24 and then I can crop in, right? But my camera is a 23 megapixel camera. It's not that high. So I prefer taking two lenses. Two lenses isn't a lot for me. I just need to take a small, very small, light backpack. And it just needs to be able to hold my tripod and maybe a bottle of water and these two lenses. And the two lenses really just one lens because one lens is on my camera. So, sometimes the camera is on my shoulder, backpack is on me, and I'm walking around. And if I need to change, I change, but it doesn't happen very often. If I'm doing landscapes, I tend to keep one or the other on there. And, really it's whatever goes on there first that day, whatever I need first, kind of just stays on because part of it is laziness, convenience. If I put that 35 on the first time, then I kind of, just make the 35 work most of the day. When I need to pop that 24 on, then the 24 ends up staying on most of the rest of the day. The point here is it's my preference. You're going to have your preference. I like the sharper images. Landscapes you're shooting at f8 anyway, f11, up there somewhere, f5, 6. So I'm not doing it, I don't take those primes in there because of the wider f-stop. That's not the reason. If you're shooting at night, they might be practical if you're shooting stars and stuff. But for the most part, it's the clarity of the images for me. In summary, for landscapes and actually for other types of photography, a good high-resolution lens and a high megapixel camera is all you need because you can crop. And by a high-resolution lens, for those of you that are listening to that for the first time and going, what is he talking about? For example, I shoot Canon, so there's the EF line of lenses for the DSLRs, right? And those lenses were designed to go up to a certain megapixel count. Their sharpness, their clarity, right? Their low distortion is meant to go up to a certain megapixel count. Maybe it was 35 megapixels, I don't know. But when the RF mount lenses came out, Canon knew those would be functional on the R5, on cameras that are coming out like the R3 and the R1, and cameras that are coming after that, right? Those cameras may have 60, 80 megapixels, you don't know. So those lenses from scratch were designed with much more clarity, much lower distortion, and they're designed for higher megapixels. So you can take advantage of those high megapixel cameras. Putting an EF lens on one of those cameras, you're kind of cutting them short, right? So that's what I mean by if you're going to shoot with a high megapixel camera, make sure you have a high resolution lens. Make sure you have a lens that's designed for that camera. So having a good camera with high megapixels, the higher the better, for cropping purposes. It gives you less and less reasons to own and carry around heavy zoom lenses because you can just crop. You can take wider pictures and crop them and you don't lose a lot. The last category I want to include, and there are more categories. I'm just picking the popular ones, right? And children and pets, I kind of include those in portraiture. The last category is lifestyle/family. Now, this could be a professional shooting lifestyle photography or a person that just bought their first camera and they want to shoot their family. The lens to have in that case that's more practical is probably going to be a zoom lens. A zoom lens is going to give you a little bit of flexibility. If you're across the room and you need to zoom in quickly, you can zoom in. If you need to widen back a little bit, if you're shooting lifestyle outdoors, indoors, it just gives you more flexibility. Of course, a better zoom lens is better. That has a wide opening, like we said, or faster. But if that gets expensive, then you go with like a kit zoom lens for now. It does the job. You put the camera in aperture priority or shutter priority, and you even let it, do like automatic ISO, and all you have to do is just set the aperture or the shutter speed, and you have so much flexibility. You can take pictures quickly, and you end up with pretty decent pictures. I hope that these descriptions with the different types of photography and what lenses I would use have been helpful. If anything, just to spark a little thought, right? I'm not trying to tell anybody what to do or not do. That's not what this channel is about. If you know and if you follow this channel, it's about broad thinking, keeping the mind, flexible to different things. So hopefully by hearing me and by hearing what lenses I would use and why, you can say, you know what, I agree with Juan, or I completely disagree with Juan because what I need is a little different from what he's explaining here. I understand why he uses it, but that's not my reason for carrying the opposite. And this brings us to our conclusion. Prime lenses versus zoom lenses. Is one better than the other? Typically not, but for specific areas of photography, absolutely. Whatever you decide to do, don't look back. If you buy a lens and you end up saying, I wish I had bought the zoom, you know what? When you buy prime lenses, I didn't mention this, one of the advantages of prime lenses is that they tend to spark more creativity. Why? Because the minute you put a prime lens on your camera, you're limited. You don't have that flexibility of a zoom lens. You have to walk around more to compose your pictures. Hence, you start to say, how can I get the most out of this lens? I have a 50mm 1.8. That was my first lens for years because we couldn't afford more when I started, right? My parents gave me my first camera and they gave me my first lens, and the camera was a Canon F1. It was one of the most expensive cameras you could buy at the time. So the lens was a very simple 50mm 1.8 kit lens. And I did miracles for, my knowledge back then with that little lens. I walked around New York City, up and down, zigzagging all the streets, just getting so creative with that lens. And I learned so much about a 50mm and what it can do and what it can't do. And you get very creative. So that when you finally pop that zoom lens on there, you have the creativity already, and now you have flexibility to add on. But if you start with a hefty zoom lens and you sit back, right, kick your feet up, and you just zoom in and out of everything, you lose a little bit of that creativity because you don't have to walk around as much. You don't have to worry so much about composition. It's always there for you, right, just by zooming in and out, and you don't think of possibly other angles or other heights, right? So with that, I end by saying, please like this video down below, subscribe if you haven't already, click the little notification bell so that other videos will come your way and you hear a little ding dong. Leave comments and questions, please, and share this with people that might find it helpful. I love you guys from the bottom of my heart, always. Love to see you on here, and I hope to see you again in the next video. Ciao for now.